I've started to watch season 2 of Daredevil. I'm 3 episodes in, and I'm not going to spoil anything. I just want to talk in very general terms about it. I'm really enjoying it so far. Well, actually, what I should say really is that it starts slow. I've made notes after watching each of these episodes about what I watched, and the first episode I liked. Second episode I wasn't crazy about. Third episode, huge improvement. So what I'm saying basically is that it starts off slow, season 2 does. Or at least that's the way I feel. But the third episode really got back. Well, I'm not sure if it got back to what was good about season 1, but it really did something good. At least good in my books. The meetings, the confrontations that happen in that third episode are really great. But you really do need, I guess you need the first 2 episodes to put it together. But there's some stuff in the first 2 episodes that just drag and that just really didn't impress me, and it kind of felt like they were stretching things out a little bit too much. But the third episode, wow. I mean, the whole episode, it starts off a little slow, kind of like the first 2 episodes for the season are a little slow. But that third episode, wow. I mean, it was just such a big improvement, and even before there's any real action in this episode, I thought it was really good. And that's all. Well, I mean, I should say a couple other things. I do like the way that I like the Punisher so far. I like the way he's being played. He's one of the more interesting parts of the season, I think, so far. I'm only 3 episodes in. And I've been watching this 1 episode per week. I watched the first episode that first weekend that it was available. And that's my plan to continue doing that because I don't binge watch. So it's probably going to take me until the end of June or maybe even early July before I finished watching season 2 of Daredevil. Dave Talks Comics, episode 109, Silver Age Nick Fury. Welcome to Dave Talks Comics, the program where I talk about comic books I have read, cartoons I have watched, and comic book conventions to which I have gone. All past episodes can be streamed or downloaded from the program's website, davetalkscomics.com. On this episode, I will be talking about some early appearances of Nick Fury as Sergeant Fury in his own comic book, the first, third, and 13th issues of Sergeant Fury, and then later as Colonel Nick Fury in Fantastic Four number 21 and Tales of Suspense number 78. As always, my talk will include a summary, which will include spoilers, my reactions to various things in the comic book, and a little bit of research I've done into the character and his appearance in comic books. This is the first of what I hope will be, well, actually it's not the first, it's the second of what I hope will be several episodes, maybe more than that, on Silver Age Marvel stories. The first one was episode 99, where I talked about some issues, mostly Tales of Suspense, but it was all Iron Man themed. And one of the characters that appeared in those issues, in some of those issues, at least one, that I want to talk about, I want to devote this episode to, is Nick Fury. I'm not going to cover the entire run of Nick Fury in the Silver Age, but I want to talk about a few crucial issues. And I'm not going to talk about probably what is the most famous. Well, I will a little bit, but I'm not going to focus on what is the most famous run of Nick Fury. Nick Fury first appeared in Sergeant Fury number 1, which was cover dated May of 1963. It was titled 7 Against the Nazis. It was written by Stan Lee with art by Jack Kirby and Dick Ayers. This story, Nick Fury's an interesting character because he starts off as a World War II character and then becomes considerably more than that. This is the first appearance of Nick Fury and of the Howling Commandos. The book is called Sergeant Fury, although on the title it says Sergeant Fury and the Howling Commandos. And in this issue, Sergeant Fury and the Howling Commandos are tasked with saving a Frenchman who has been captured by the Nazis and knows all about the D-Day invasion plans. I'm not going to go into detail about this story, and I'll explain that in a few minutes. One other thing that this issue includes, and I should say that all of these issues that I'm going to talk about today have been reprinted more than once, and they are all available on Marvel Unlimited if you have that service. If that service is still available, who knows how far in the future somebody might be listening to this. But I believe they've all been reprinted in either Essentials or Marvel Masterworks or possibly some other collections. The only other feature that this issue has is a Weapons of War section where it gives you little details about some of the weapons that you see in these issues. So that's the first issue of Sergeant Fury. The other issue I wanted to mention is Sergeant Fury number 3, which is dated September of 1963. This issue is titled Midnight on Massacre Mountain, and it is written, once again, it's the exact same team. It's written by Stan Lee. The art is by Jack Kirby and Dick Ayers. And in this issue, Sergeant Fury and the Howling Commandos are sent to rescue a division of American troops who were surrounded by the Nazis on or near Massacre Mountain. And along the way, they meet Major Reed Richards of the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, which was the precursor or the predecessor of the CIA, and only existed for a few years, I believe, during World War II, and maybe for a year afterwards or something like that. But once, I'm pretty sure just about everything that was in the OSS and a lot, if not most, if not all of the personnel were later rolled into the CIA. Now, the reason why I'm not going to talk about these issues is because there's a podcast out there that has already talked about these issues, and that is Wahoo. It only ran for 10 episodes, so they only covered the first 10 issues. Each episode covers an issue of the Sergeant Fury comic book. So they only covered the first 10 issues, and you can find that at furycast.podwits.com. Or probably if you just do a Google search for Wahoo Podcast, you'd probably find it. There's a couple other things I want to say about the Sergeant Fury comic book. There were a couple notable first appearances, other than the fact that it was the first appearance of Sergeant Fury and the Howling Commandos, and those are in issue 5. We have the first appearance of Baron Strucker. And in issue 8, the first appearance of Baron Zemo, although I think he's called Dr. Zemo in that issue. And, well, actually, is that the first appearance? I'm not sure. When I looked it up on Comic Book DB, it said that Avengers number 6 was the first appearance, but they both came out in the same month, so I'm not sure how. It's possible that Avengers 6 came out a week or two before Sergeant Fury number 8, but I'm not sure. I didn't actually read those issues. I only read the first 3 issues of Sergeant Fury and one other that I'm going to talk about in a little bit. Now, this was not my introduction to Nick Fury. The first Nick Fury comic book that I read, or comic book in which he appeared that I read, was Captain America numbers 265, 266. That was the first story that I saw Nick Fury in. That was my introduction to Nick Fury. I had a subscription to Captain America at that time, which I believe started with issue 2 264. No, 263. That's right. It started with 263, but for some reason I never got 264. But then I did get like 265 to 276, I think. So I only had a year's subscription to it. So Nick Fury appeared in those two issues, 265 and 266. He also appeared in 273 and 274. The Howling Commandos also appeared in those issues. They hadn't appeared in the other two issues. And all four of those issues were written by David Anthony Kraft and drawn by Mike Zeck and John Beatty. And I remember enjoying those stories quite a bit. I haven't gone back to read them. I still have the issues. But I haven't gone back to read them in quite some time. I think they are available on Marvel Unlimited, and I believe they have recently been collected in one of those Epic Collection books that Marvel is doing these days. The next book I want to talk about is Fantastic Four number 21, which is cover dated December of 1963. The title of the story is The Hate Monger, and this is written by Stan Lee with art by Jack Kirby and George Roussos. This is the significance of this issue is that it's the first modern or contemporary appearance of Nick Fury, and this is the first time he appears as Colonel Fury, not Sergeant Fury, but Colonel Fury. Although in this issue, and I believe this is the only issue in which this happened, his only appearance in which this happened, his only modern appearance in which this happened, there's no mention of S.H.I.E.L.D., and he isn't wearing an eye patch. In fact, he introduces himself as an agent of the CIA. So this issue, the bad guy in this issue is the Hate Monger, and this is also the first appearance of the Hate Monger. In this issue, which focuses for the most part on the Fantastic Four. It's not a Nick Fury story. He plays an important part in the story, but it's definitely a Fantastic Four story. And the Fantastic Four gets blasted by the Hate Monger's H-Ray or Hate Ray after they bust up a rally of his in New York City. Now, when they get hit with this ray, what it does is it makes them hate one another, and it's kind of strange. I'm not completely clear on exactly how this hate ray works, but I thought the hate ray just made people hate other people, and I didn't think it was that specific. So that seemed a little strange to me. Anyway, they fight amongst one another until Nick Fury shows up and seems to give them something else. Well, it's not that they turn their anger on Nick Fury, but they wind up going to San Gusto, which is a small South American country, after Nick Fury shows up and tells them about the situation in San Gusto. And the situation basically is that there's a U.S.-backed government which is being threatened by a revolution. And if you know anything about history, there was a lot of this in the 1960s, in the Caribbean and in South America, of the CIA interfering with internal politics in a number of countries. And so here we have the CIA getting the superheroes to get involved and do the CIA's dirty work for them. Although in this case, the villain is actually a supervillain and not just a regime that leans to the left, which quite often was the villains, or revolutionaries who lead to the left, who quite often were the villains in a lot of these revolutions as depicted by the CIA. So anyway, focusing on the comic books and not the real world politics of the 1960s, although there's certainly a touch of that in this, and there's a touch of that in this, what I've talked about so far in this podcast. So the Fantastic Four take off for San Gusto, and the Hate Monger hears about this, and so he heads there. And apparently he had been headquartered there, or he'd had some ties to there. He heads there in his underground tunneling transport. And there's an editor's note which claims that the Russians have built or were working on just such a device, which uses reverse thrust of a rocket to do the tunneling. And they kind of show this in the comic book. Anyhow, eventually there's a showdown with the hate monger in San Gusto. And when the hate monger is fighting the Fantastic Four, and Nick Fury is kind of along for the ride in all this. And he's there, but the FF are the one doing the fighting when the hate monger attempts to use his hate ray on the FF and ends up shooting his own men with the hate ray, and then they shoot him and kill him. And then when they take off his hood, because I hadn't explained this, hate monger is dressed in a costume, and part of his costume is this. His costume is purple and pink, and it's got a big H on his chest, on his torso. I mean, it really goes down below his chest. It's his whole torso that's covered by this H. And his hood, which looks like something that the KKK would wear. And when he was in New York City, and he had this rally going in New York City, he was basically talking about, keeping people from immigrating. I mean, this is something which, honestly, I don't want to get into current politics, but it sounds like something somebody might say today. It doesn't seem like that distant past, even though the comic book is over 50 years old. And I suppose this is something which has come up in, not just in the United States, but in other countries for centuries, if not thousands of years. People objecting to people immigrating to their country. So getting back to the story at hand, the hate monger gets killed by his own men, and when this hood is removed at the end of the story, the face beneath the hood is that of Adolf Hitler. Or maybe not. It certainly looks like Adolf Hitler, but Mr. Fantastic speculates that it could be a double, that Adolf Hitler was supposed to have had doubles, people who looked exactly like him. And if you read the official handbook of the Marvel Universe, which is where I first heard of the hate monger, he was a clone of Hitler. And apparently Arnim Zola had used some technology to clone Hitler and then transfer his mind into this body. And then Hitler's original body was destroyed, but then clones were made of the clone. And according to the OHATMU, there's been, and this was as of the early 1980s, there had been at least 6 clones, 6 different hate mongers. So in this story, one of them is killed, but there were more than this. As I mentioned before, this was the first appearance of Colonel Nick Fury. The first appearance of Nick Fury, Agent of S.H.I.E.L.D., was in Strange Tales number 135, about a year and a half later, in August, cover dated August 1965. And Nick Fury's run in that book went from issue 135 to 168, which came out in May of 1968, which was the same month that he appeared in Iron Man number 1, which I talked about on episode 99. Following issue 168 of Strange Tales, he started to appear in his own book, Nick Fury, Agent of S.H.I.E.L.D. Now, that only ran for 15 issues from June of 68 to November of 69. The creator, who is best known for working on Nick Fury, especially in this period, would be Jim Steranko. And his run on Nick Fury ran from as a penciler from issue 151 to 168 to the end of the run in Strange Tales, and then 4 of the first 5 issues of Nick Fury of Agent of S.H.I.E.L.D., issues 1 through 3 and issue 5, all of which have been collected. I have a number of them in a collection, I think that's called Nick Fury, Agent of S.H.I.E.L.D. or something like that. He was doing the penciling starting with issue 151, and then starting with issue 154 of Strange Tales, he was also doing the writing. Prior to that, I believe Jack Kirby had been the penciler and Stan Lee had been the writer. And he also drew those issues of Nick Fury. He also wrote those issues of Nick Fury, Agent of S.H.I.E.L.D. The next book that I want to talk about it goes back to World War II, and this is Sergeant Fury number 13, which is dated December of 1964. And the title of this issue is Fighting Side by Side with Captain America and Bucky. And once again, the art team, or the creative team, is the same as it was in the other two issues of Sergeant Fury that I mentioned, and that would be Stan Lee, Jack Kirby, and Dick Ayers. So this issue is the first meeting of Captain America or I should probably say of Sergeant Fury, since it's his book, and Captain America. Early in the issue, we see Sergeant Fury meeting PFC, Private First Class, Steve Rogers, for the first time in a pub in London. Now, this is, of course, during World War II. And Rogers is about to get beaten up by another sergeant by the name of Bull McGivney when Fury steps in, and then the rest of the Howlers join him, and it's the Howlers, Sergeant Fury and the Howlers versus Bull McGivney and his men. And in the end, the Howlers definitely get the better of the other soldiers, and McGivney and his guys wind up in the hospital, and Sergeant Fury and the Howling Commandos get rewarded by their commanding officer, Captain Happy Sam Sawyer, with hours of intense training. So then the story shifts to Cap and Bucky, and they get sent across the English Channel to do some recon there was a report that the Nazis have are building up some arms. While they're in the process of doing this recon, they find some American pilots who were shot down recently, just 3 of them, and liberate them. They also discover some slave laborers who were from France and Poland and Czechoslovakia. After rescuing the pilots and sending them towards the coast, Cap tells them to send word to send the Howlers to Cap. That's a quote. So anyway, back in England, the Howlers are more than ready. When the word comes down that Cap needs the Howlers are more than ready to go. They're, get away from their CO, their commanding officer, Happy Sam, and they want to see some action. So after they get across the channel, they get split up. Fury and Reb Ralston, and the story at this point basically focuses on Fury and Reb Ralston, and a little bit on Cap and Bucky. Fury and Reb Ralston end up boarding a freight train, which it turns out is carrying slave laborers, amongst whom Fury recognizes one of them is Steve Rogers. Then Bucky shows up, disguised as Hitler Youth, and there's really no explanation given here as to how Cap and Bucky got on this train. And it occurs to me now, I've just been assuming that everybody knows that Steve Rogers is Captain America, but I don't know, with all the movies out, I think people would know that, especially if they're listening to a podcast like this, especially as, I don't have a ton of listeners, so I think odds are most people, everybody probably who's listening to this knows that Steve Rogers is Captain America. Anyhow, the train arrives at a construction site, which is known as Operation Einfall, which is the German word for invasion. And everybody's put to work, the slave laborers, the soldiers, Cap or Steve Rogers and Fury and Reb Ralston. Fury tries to give Rogers his gun, but Rogers won't take it. And then Rogers gets separated from Fury and Ralston. Then there's an explosion. I'm going through this a little fast, but there isn't a whole lot of depth in these Silver Age issues. So I'm just trying to give you an idea of what happened here. There's an explosion. Cap shows up with Bucky. The Americans, Captain America, Bucky, Sergeant Fury, Reb Ralston, wreak more havoc at the Nazi construction site before blowing it sky high and escaping. And that's basically the end of the story. Then there's a little bit of an after, and an epilogue, which happens in London. But anyhow, on the whole, this story doesn't quite live up to what I hoped for. I guess I was expecting, based on the cover, I was expecting a story in which we see Cap I mean, he does to a degree towards the end fight side by side with the Howling Commandos, although, well, two of them, Sergeant Fury and Reb Ralston. But I was expecting something more where they all go in together on a mission. I don't know. Maybe I'm being picky here, but it's not a bad story. It's just not a great story. And it's definitely a Silver Age story, and it's definitely nothing. It definitely does not, I mean, it has to be read within the context in which it was written. I do want to point out some of the artwork that I thought really stood out and that I really liked. There is for starters, there's the cover, which I think has been homaged probably a number of times. The people have done their own versions of it, which shows Cap in the center, up in front, and you see Bucky behind him, and you see the Howlers, Sergeant Fury, and the Howling Commandos coming up behind as well. And unfortunately, you didn't get a scene exactly like this in the issue, but it's a really great cover, I think. The next issue, or the next page that I wanted to talk about, was page 7, where there's at the top of the page, the top two panels, we see the Nazis firing guns as Cap and Bucky escape on a motorcycle. And it's just something about there, just the way that Jack Kirby draws those guns, and I don't know, the angle of it all, and the way they color the panel, because there's two panels here that I'm thinking of, the top two panels. And the one panel is the sky is normal blue, I guess, but in the other panel where Cap and Bucky are on the motorcycle escaping, it's one of those panels where everything's kind of in red, or not everything's in red, but the background's in red, and Cap and Bucky are kind of in yellow, and there's something about it, and just the motion of it, and the motorcycle jumping through the air, and it just really works for me. I really like this. The next panel that I wanted to talk about, there's a panel, the third panel on page 10, where you see Cap dodging a rifle grenade, and it's not just, I mean, it's very acrobatic what he's doing, and it's very acrobatic what he's doing, and it's also the way that Jack Kirby drew it. It's the angles of it all, and Cap's kind of balanced on one hand. He's got both feet up in the air, and the grenade's shooting underneath him, and you can see the guy, the Nazi soldier, the German soldier who's firing the grenade, and the sound effect and all of it just all works beautifully together. Speaking of grenades, then the third panel on page 14 is a German soldier has thrown a grenade, and you see the grenade exploding, and you see let's see, is it all of this is before the Howlers get split up, or the Howling Commandos. I keep calling them the Howlers. I don't know why. But this is before the Howling Commandos get split up, so Fury and Reb Ralston are still with the Howling Commandos, and this grenade goes off, and once again, this is another panel where they use these color choices, which I think is something you don't see as much of these days. But, so you only have like two basic colors, well maybe 3 or 4. I mean, it's basically red, and like a brown, and a pink, and a black, and maybe a little bit of white as well. And it's just the effect of seeing the explosion of the grenade and everybody kind of getting blown by the force of the explosion in different directions. And it's just the way it's done. It's really... And of course, this is all being drawn by Jack Kirby, who is somebody who actually served in the Army in World War II. And not only did he serve in the Army in World War II, but he served in Europe as, if I understand correctly, as a scout. And so he saw combat. He wasn't somebody who was viewing this from home. I mean, it's definitely honorable to serve, period. But to have actually been through this stuff, he actually has some perspective on actually being there and what it would be like. And I think that's important. The final panel that I want to talk about is another explosion. And actually, this one's a little different. And this is on page 22. And in this case, it looks like a photo montage. This is something that Kirby, I believe, did later on, especially when he went to DC Comics. when he was doing his work on the New Gods. And I know he did some covers like that. I don't know if he ever did any other work like this at Marvel, but it's the explosion when the Operation Einfall construction site gets blown apart. And so instead of drawing it, I don't know if this was, I suspect that that he did some photo, this is a montage. He has taken things from different places and put them together to make this image. But I'm not certain. But it's an interesting contrast to the rest of, it's definitely different from the rest of the issue. So that's it for, okay, so I've got one more issue I want to talk about. That's it for the first meeting of Captain America and Nick Fury. Now this next issue is the first contemporary or modern meeting of Captain America and Nick Fury, and that is from Tales of Suspense number 78, which is cover dated June of 1966. This issue was entitled Them, and it was written by Stan Lee, and the art was by Jack Kirby and Frank Giacoia. Now, Them is the organization that will later be known as AIM. In fact, I think this may be the only appearance where they are referred to as Them, unless there were retro stories that were done in which they were called Them. But I believe in their next appearance, their name has been changed to AIM. Or the next time they are given a name, it is AIM. Because this story came from Tales of Suspense, it's not a full issue. Tales of Suspense at this point was divided. You had there was two stories in each issue. One story was Captain America and one story was Iron Man. And I believe usually the covers would alternate between a Captain America cover and an Iron Man cover. And so each character got basically half the issue. And so stories would normally take at least 2 issues to tell. And this story opens up with Fury showing up at Avengers headquarters looking for Captain America and walking in while Cap is in the midst of a training session. After introductions, Fury tells Cap about them, and he shows Cap this miniature brain which was was captured, I think is the word they use in the issue, from them, which Them developed, and Them is, of course, the enemy, in case that wasn't clear. And after all, MODOK came from AIM, which was originally known as Them. So anyway, while they're chatting about Them, while they're chatting about Them sends an android to kill Fury and Cap. I was never really clear on why they changed the name from Them to AIM, but as I talk about Them, I can see that it becomes very confusing if you keep saying Them this and Them that. So Them sends an android to kill Fury and Cap. But that takes up most of this story here. It is not to be continued. It's all done in one or done in a half. And so once the android is defeated, it disintegrates. And I should say that this is not an android like the Vision. It's more like a clone, an augmented human maybe, a metahuman, which is armed with all sorts of weapons. And they defeat it by forcing a knockout pill down its throat. Which I thought was kind of weird, because I guess originally I was thinking it was when they said android, I was thinking a machine like the Vision or the original. Well, I guess the original Human Torch was the Vision, at least as it was originally, as his origin was originally told. But it's not. I mean, in this case, it's not. These are clones, so these are like, laboratory grown people. As opposed to, basically what they're talking about is DNA. And So the story ends, and I mean, basically what this story does is like I said, it's the first appearance of Cap. It's the first meeting of Cap and Colonel Nick Fury of S.H.I.E.L.D. And it basically sets things up for future stories when Captain America will work for S.H.I.E.L.D. And there's plenty of those. And then at the very end, what you see is next issue, Return of the Red Skull. And I just want to say that I do plan to read this, and I do want to talk about this on this program, so hopefully I will at some point in the future. Although the next Silver Age Marvel that I want to talk about is Iron Man. I want to go back and read some more issues of Iron Man. But after that, I will probably come back, and that will almost certainly be the first story of Cap that I want to discuss. Just a couple more things on the Sergeant Fury comic book. Sergeant Fury, which was a World War II comic book exclusively, ran from May of 1963 to July of 1974 for 120 issues. It was called Sergeant Fury, but on the covers I think it always said Sergeant Fury and His Howling Commandos. After issue 120, the title was officially changed to Sergeant Fury and His Howling Commandos, and it ran another 47 issues from 121 to 167. And the last issue came out in December of 1981, although at this point it was all reprints of old stories. So that's it for my coverage of Nick Fury in the Silver Age. I'll admit I did not cover the stories which are probably considered the most classic by the most fans, which is the Jim Steranko issues of Nick Fury, Agent of S.H.I.E.L.D. I don't know if I'll ever go back to cover those. I have read them a couple times. I found them to be, at least in the stories, a little dated. Maybe at this point I could read them now a little more objectively, understanding that they are creatures of their time, at least as far as the stories themselves. I think what stands out most about Jim Steranko isn't so much the stories he told as it is the way he told the stories and the way he would put together a page, the way he would put together a cover, that sort of thing. I think that's where Jim Steranko's legacy really lies. I mean, I think that's where the importance of his work does, that he influenced a lot of people, a lot of other artists, in showing them new ways to put together a page, and people were very taken by his artwork, and I think for good reason. But I'm not sure if the stories themselves are perfect or are that great. I would have to go back and read them at this point. It's definitely been at least probably 5 or 6 years since I read that collection. Anyhow, so that's it for Nick Fury in the Silver Age. I'm not sure if these are great stories. In fact, I don't think they're great stories, but I think they're important stories. And quite often I find myself wanting to go and find those stories that when I was much younger, I would find references to in comic books, and, read the early appearances of these characters. They don't always provide a whole lot of insight to who the characters are, because quite often sometimes the importance of those issues, well, if it's the first appearance, I think it's pretty clear what the importance is. But sometimes the nuances that are worked into those stories weren't in those stories originally, and are added much later on by writers who refer to those stories. And for that reason, not necessarily for that reason, but so I like to go back and read these stories to see what they were actually like and to see how they read in their time. And sometimes I'm pleasantly surprised. I don't think any of these stories are bad stories. I think that, like all Silver Age comics, they have to be read in the context in which they were written. You can't really compare them to comic books today. I mean, you can. Certainly the artwork can be compared, but I mean, you've got to understand the techniques were different. Certainly coloring was not what it is today. And it was a different world. I mean, you certainly will find, certain elements in these comic books that people today find objectionable, certain amount of sexism, certain amount of racism in older comic books. I don't think you saw as much racism in comic books in the 60s as you had in the 40s, when it was much more overt in some comic books, but it was still there. But my point is that these are creations of their time, and while you can judge them based on today's standards, you have to also, I think it needs to be understood. You need to understand the world in which they were created, which is not an excuse for what they were, but is an explanation for how they came to be what they wound up being. So I went back and I listened to what I recorded, what you just listened to, and I blame Cap. It's his fault. That's why I started to call them the Howlers, because at some point during issue 13 of Sergeant Fury, Cap said, "Send the Howlers." And then I started calling them the Howlers. I stopped calling them the Howling Commandos. So it's Cap's fault. I was just following his example. And who can blame me, after all? He's Captain America. Come on. I did a little bit of research on the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, in issue 3 of Sergeant Fury. The Sergeant Fury and the Howling Commandos met Major Reed Richards of the OSS. So the OSS, in the real world at least, was founded in June of 1942 and was disbanded in September of 1945. It was soon but not immediately followed by the CIA. So the CIA was not its immediate successor, but it wasn't, I think it was less than a year later that the CIA was formed. There were 13,000 employees of the OSS, and I think that's in total. I don't think that's at one time. And it had operations in both the European and Asian theaters of operations, as they used to call it back then during World War II. And you'll often hear referred to in movies and books and those sorts of things, and podcasts, I guess. And I got all this information from Wikipedia, so you can certainly Google or look up OSS or Office of Strategic Services on Wikipedia. There's lots more information there, but that's just a rough outline. There was a couple mentions of the OSS as depicted in other media, or in media, I guess. One of the things that was mentioned was 13 Rue Madeline, which is a film from 1946, which starred James Cagney. I saw this probably at least 25 years ago. I'm not sure exactly when I saw it. It was something that I saw on TV. I think I taped it because it was on late at night. And I watched it the next day or soon thereafter. And I thought it was pretty good back then, but honestly, I haven't gone back to watch it recently. I mean, I'm sure there's a certain amount of flag waving in it, but I thought it was a pretty good film. I also noticed that there were some references to DC Comics. DC Comics had a recurring feature in GI Combat called OSS, Office of Strategic Services. Because GI Combat was made up of all these different features where there would be different characters, different teams, and so one of them was the OSS. And that ran from, it didn't appear in every single issue of GI Combat, but it first showed up in issue 192, which was cover dated July of 1976, and its final appearance in GI Combat was in issue 272, which was not the last issue of GI Combat. That ran for about another year, I think, and that was December of 1984. And that also led me to, this is research I did on the comic book DB, com. And that led me to a Batman Elseworld story called Batman Dark Allegiances by Howard Chaykin, which is a graphic novel. And so now I'm interested in buying that and reading that. But I definitely don't have that. I definitely have never read that. I was completely unaware of that. And I have been reading some other comic books by Howard Chaykin. Well, I did a couple episodes on Howard Chaykin's 3-issue Black Hawk miniseries. And I talked about that miniseries on episodes 15 and 17 of Dave Talks Comics, but the episodes were not devoted entirely to the Black Hawk. There was a number of other comic books that I talked about. And recently I read Howard Chaykin's miniseries that he did, I think just before the Black Hawk miniseries, on The Shadow, Blood, and Judgment. And that might show up on a future episode of Dave Talks Comics, but I'm not certain at this point. But the point is that I'm interested in reading more Howard Chaykin, and running into his name as I'm doing research on the OSS makes me want to pick up this graphic novel. I have no idea if it's any good or not. I have not seen any reviews of it, but I'm interested. That's it for episode 109 of Dave Talks Comics. Dave Talks Comics can be found on the internet at davetalkscomics.com and facebook.com/DaveTalksComics. On Twitter, @DaveTalksComics. Email can be sent to davetalkscomics@gmail.com. I'm Dave. Thank you for listening.